My name is Michael Allen, and my talk is on many exposures to a real-world object without knowing the details. The focus of attention doesn't include entire objects, but only the relevant level of abstraction. So I'll start by asking the question, how are objects stored in working memory? This question usually refers to what kind of... Yeah, there we go. This question usually refers to what kind of representations working memory operates over. What representations do you hold in mind when you're processing and storing objects in the visual field? It could be bound representations, often thought of, or something like individual features or hierarchical feature bundles. And an alternative way of looking at this question is to ask what's encoded into working memory in the apprehension of an object. So for example, imagine that you ask someone what time it is and they show you their watch. What information will you retain about the watch a moment later? Unless you're motivated, probably very little. You might remember the time, maybe the face color or the strap color, and perhaps the brand name. But for example, you might not know whether the time was represented with numerals or markings. And what does this tell us about the representation of the watch in mind? There's going to be some representation of the watch held in mind, but that representation will be unlikely to include all the watch details. The memory for the object watch, the representation of that object, is not binary between remembering or forgetting, bound or unbound. Rather, this representation will vary as to how much detail it has, depending on whatever details were salient or necessary to process given task demands. And so what we're suggesting here is that the encoding of an object into memory isn't all or none. The visual information that makes up the object can be encoded at different levels of specificity or detail depending on the task. And so to demonstrate this, we look at the classic demonstration that people have a poor memory for penny details despite handling pennies thousands of times. And we ask, is this a function of encoding demands as opposed to some forgetting of those details? So we set up a study where participants answered whether the penny was on the left or right in compared with a real coin foil. They did this 12 times and then they got a surprise question. And the question here is which of these is the real penny, and it's paired with a fake penny that differs, in this case, by the direction of the head. Then they do 12 more trials of the location question, and they get a second surprise trial. This time the fake penny differs by the location of the word liberty and the year. So on the location trials, the pre-surprise trials, they have a very high accuracy. It's extremely easy to indicate left or right to the real penny. But when they get the first surprise question, their performance is significantly worse compared to the location trials, despite having seen the penny now several times. Even on the second surprise question, when they've already had a surprise question and they've been prompted that they might be asked these extra questions, the performance, their memory for penny details is still not good enough to match the location trial accuracy. So what could be causing this poor memory? To distinguish the penny from other coins, you only need to encode a small amount of information in the apprehension. Something like that it's small, has a head, is copper, and has some text. Something like that will be enough to distinguish penny in everyday use. But what if society was flooded with fake penny coins and there was a high penalty for their circulation? This level of encoding would not be enough to distinguish the real penny from the fake pennies, because all of these pennies fit underneath that level of encoding, and you will be motivated to encode the penny at a higher specificity, something that distinguishes appropriately, something like small copper and the head is facing right and liberty is on the left, etc. And now we're going to have a better memory for penny details because the encoding is more specific. So to test out whether this does actually lead to a better memory for penny details, we ran the same study again, except this time adding in fake pennies for 50% of the foils. And what we found was that their accuracy was again high in the location trials, although attenuated. And then their accuracy on the two surprise trials was no different from the location trials. Their memory was robust across the surprise trials. When distinguishing a penny from other real coins, the memory is poor for the details within the penny, even after attending to the penny and processing it dozens of times. When those foils include fake coins, there's no decrease in performance on the surprise trials. And we're suggesting that this is because poor memory for penny details isn't a consequence of forgetting, It is determined by what needs to be encoded in order for the penny to be identified amongst distractors. When we're using the penny, what do we need to encode to successfully use it? To investigate this idea further, we look at a more recent example of memory failure for object details known as attribute amnesia. Subjects got a display like this with a letter and 3 numbers, and they're asked to find the letter and report its color. The authors asked how well can the subjects remember the letter identity on a surprise trial when they're asked that information. So they performed this color report task 11 times, and then they got a surprise question. This was, what was the letter you just saw given these 4 options? They then repeated this question 4 times as control trials. So what they found was that the accuracy on the reporting the color of the letter was high, 84%, in the pre-surprise trials. But when the surprise trials came up, only 40% of subjects were able to reliably report the identity of the letter they had just processed. And this is compared with the next control trial where they're again asked the identity information, but this time 80% of people got it correct. The increase in performance here from the surprise to control trial suggests that there is amnesia for letter identity in the surprise trial. And this is what we call attribute amnesia. We can highlight this difference between the surprise and control trial and use it as a measure of attribute amnesia. And we'll report only this measure in the following studies. So participants found the letter to report its color reliably on all of these trials, but they were unable to report the identity of the letter that they just processed. And how can this be? How can it be that the letter is processed when the focus of attention, but not reliably remembered? The authors considered different possible sources for this failure and concluded that it was due to the identity information not being consolidated into memory. And what we suggest here with these studies is that there's a possible different explanation that the identity information was just not encoded in the first place in the apprehension of the letter. Is it possible that attribute amnesia is caused because subjects are only encoding the letter category? The category letters is an overlearned set. McCluskey and Schubert in 2014 suggest that observers activate category information of letters independently of identity information. Recognition of letters as members of letter category might be so automatic that the specific identity isn't even encoded. To test this idea of letter category membership, we show participants a display like this of 4 or 8 items for 500 milliseconds and then questioned what they knew about the display afterwards. There were 2 conditions: letters, in which the display is all letters or has 1 number in it, and first half, second half, in which the display is either all letters from one half of the alphabet only or a mixture between the 2. And we ask, can subjects reliably report that all the items are letters without even knowing the letter identities of all the items? And secondly, is this different when the category is not an overlearned or automatic category, something like first half, second half of the alphabet? Performance in the letter condition is not affected by set size, compared with performance on the first half, second half condition, which was significantly worse at set size 8. Participants remembered significantly more letters in the first half, second half condition, suggesting that they processed identity more, and performance was predicted by numbers of letters recalled in all cases except for set size 8 of the letter condition, in which the accuracy of subjects in determining that the items were all letters was independent of the number of letter identities they processed. They can look at the 8 letters and know that they're all letters without knowing their identities. So it seems that categorical information for letters can be processed without identity information. And given that, let's look at what might be going on during the attribute amnesia studies. The assumption that's made is that when attending to a letter Z, the subject must encode the identity information, that they go hand in hand as all or none. And this leaves us constrained in the explanations for why this identity information is then unavailable on the surprise trial. Our data suggests that in fact, the category information does not need identity to be activated. And so perhaps identity is not encoded at all. The subject attends to the Z, but attends to it as a member of category letter without reliably processing its individual identity. And we can compare this with the same task in which the target is now identified by being the only letter from one half of the alphabet, in this case, from the second half of the alphabet, all of the structures are from the first half. In this case, category membership is not so automatically activated. Identity is required to determine whether it's part of the target category or not. And so it's possible here that because identity information is required to be encoded to complete the task, then it should be available on the surprise question. To test this, we ran the original study again with target letter and distractors numbers as one condition, and target letter from one half of the alphabet and distractors letters from the other half as the second condition, and with a longer encoding time to allow for this being a harder task. If amnesia for letter identity is a function of whether identity is required to be encoded, then it should disappear in the first half, second half condition in which it should be required to be encoded. And what we find is that there is attribute amnesia for letter identity in the surprise trial, attenuated compared to the original study, again, because we had a longer encoding time, presumably. And then in the first half, second half condition, there was no difference in accuracy across the trials. They were just as good at the surprise trial, the control trials, and the pre-color report trials. This suggests that the difference, so we found this that when target was letter, there was amnesia for letter identity information. When target was a less well-known category like second half letter, there was no amnesia for the identity information. This suggests that the difference in these cases is that what gets encoded to perform the task determines what's subsequently remembered, as opposed to it being a function purely of consolidation. So memory for objects like the US penny and letters depend on what needs to be encoded to complete the task. Object representations are not all or none, is what we're suggesting based on this data. The same visual information can be encoded at different levels of abstraction and specificity. It's not enough to ask what was attended in the visual field, we need to also ask how it was attended. So thank you to Tim and Viola, and then to Brad and Hui for conversations about attribute amnesia, and to everyone at the Brady and Stromer labs in UCSD. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Great talk. So let's take a look at the Q&A. Okay, so there's one question from Joseph Saito. So fun stuff. I'm wondering what you think the default encoding process is. Are individuals efficiently turning off default object-based encoding process when only a subset of features are relevant, or is encoding feature-based by default?
That's a great question. I think that the default, and this is something that the project that we're working on now actually with Isabel, I think the default is something like whatever the most stable encoding is. So if we look at the watch example, like the watch has all of the properties of an object. It's got a common fate between its parts. And so you're highly likely to process the watch as one object, as opposed to, let's say, the strap as a separate object, because the strap always goes with the watch. According to kind of use space of the watch tends to be the default encoding. But again, we see people's arms that watches on them all the time and don't even process the watch. Because again, the watch and the arm have a common fate. So I think the default is not something like features versus objects, but just what is the most stable encoding? What is the most common level of encoding that is necessary for any given visual information according to like how we work with it on a daily basis.
Okay, cool. So in some sense, I think it's just like you mentioned, like how we encode information is like task defined, right?
Exactly.
I was wondering, if you think there are any like, cognitive control processes involved in order to interpret, which features are task relevant and then to direct attention for those encoding. So in some sense, is this like a attentional effect, do you think, or is more than that?
Can you say the beginning of the question again?
Oh, just like first part is, do you think there are any new cognitive control processes involved in order to, like to kind of define which features are task relevant and how to direct attention based on those information? Right.
I think it is attentional. I think it's an interaction between prior information on task demands and saliency. I think it's all operating underneath attention. That's the best answer I can give, but I think it's something that needs to be investigated a lot more. The idea that encoding is an important place to look for these kind of memory performance, I think is fairly new.